The thing about podcasting is that you can say whatever you want, right? You can be whoever you want to be behind this microphone. But if you are not digging deeper, and I say that and it sounds a little fluffy, but stay with me. The fluff, the high level conversations, those are not going to be the ones that make it across that win line next year. I don't think that if we continue to hold back, if we continue to play it safe with our content because we want everybody to like us, I don't think that we're going to be able to sustain. And I don't think that we're going to have a podcast that other people are going to be excited to share with their friends or with their family or with whomever.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you.
So much happened in 2023, and it can feel like, oh my goodness, we are going into a new year. What in the world can we plan to expect in the podcasting space in 2024? So today we are going to be talking about some of the podcast trends and what happened in 2023. Saw a lot of fun things happen and also some not so fun things happen. And then moving on to what were our 2023 predictions that I talked about last year, and then some of the predictions that I am seeing going into the podcasting space in 2024. I want you to remember that a lot of this can feel extremely overwhelming and frustrating and just like a lot. But it's important to remember that when you're looking at these predictions, when you're looking at any of this information, that you are actually taking the time to consider, is this relevant for my podcast? Is this something that I actually need to understand and to know? And make sure that you are looking at it from that lens, going back to what are your podcast goals? If we have not met, my name is Alicia Galati and I run a full service podcast management company called Galati Media, where we help business owners launch and create lead generating podcasts. That is my jam. It's what I love to do. Right now we are at over 1,600 podcast episodes that we have produced as a team, which is absolutely incredible to me. So here are some things that we saw in the beginning and through the end of 2023. The first thing that we saw was the rise of AI podcast tools, as well as some additional AI podcast things that we're going to talk through. We did have an episode where we talked about podcasting and AI and what you need to know for the future. That episode did really well, and it went through some of those tools that we really love to use for podcasting. So here are some of those tools that we really love to use. Riverside FM is a podcast recording studio. It's the best way I can describe it. But what I love about it versus other platforms or versus especially Zoom is one of the main ones that we see people use for their podcasts, is that it allows you to record to your computer and then it uploads it to the cloud. So that way it's not recording over your internet, which is always a win if you have trouble with your internet at any point in time and you want to make sure that your podcast is up and there's no issues with the audio quality because of your internet. Now, they recently came out with a brand new AI tool that allows you to create video clips of your podcast conversations, and that way you can share them on social media. So think TikToks, Reels, YouTube Shorts, etc. This is a great way to AI work your way into that. And that's actually something that I'm going to be doing with my podcast in 2024. Otter AI is another tool that we like to use, and it is fantastic. I cannot express enough how much I love Otter and the way that it allows you to transcribe your podcast episodes as well as join Zoom meetings. So this is something that I love to use as a business owner. I have Otter join my meetings to ensure that it is keeping track of those action items and anything that I need to make notes of. I can do that right in Otter And that way I can be more present in the conversation with my clients rather than having to focus on where in the world are we in this conversation and where do we need to go. It gives those action items super quickly. I also love it for podcasts because it allows you to have a detailed summary of the conversation. You can get timestamps as well as some bullet points of the episode. And then I also love a newer feature that they have where it's an AI assistant and it lets you actually ask Otter. So you can say at Otter, what is a good quote from this conversation? And then it pulls that information, which is really, really fun. Another AI tool that we use is Isotope RX. I love them for creating high quality audio editing. It is quite an investment when it comes to a solo podcaster, so I don't know that I would recommend it exactly for you. Make sure that you're fixing a lot of that stuff on the front end. But when you're like us and you are working through hours and hours of audio every month, it definitely makes sense to invest in something like Isotope RX. It really helps us to be able to take our clients' podcasts to that next level. Another tool that we use and love that has an AI feature is Auphonic. Now, Auphonic has been on the scene for quite some time, but they recently came out with an AI feature that I actually think beats Descript, which is sacrilege, apparently, because everyone loves Descript and Descript's tool to take out the ums and the ers and the uhs. Auphonic's tool is a little better, actually. They have somehow nailed the transition of taking those out without making it sound clippy and without making it sound weird. So we have used Descript. It's great and it works well, but Auphonic's recent update actually we think works a little better. With all of that in mind, there is a lot of different AI tools and different strategies that we have been implementing, obviously, and different tools that we've used over the course of 2023. But beyond that, AI has been really integrating into the content community. We saw Joe Rogan's AI Experience podcast, which came out a few episodes in April, and that he was able to create an entire episode using ChatGPT. That caused quite an uproar in the podcast community. Everyone was like, whoa, this is not cool. This is not something that we agree with, because they want to keep podcasting very human-centered rather than AI-centered. So it's a very interesting juxtaposition of AI and podcasting. And while I do not recommend that you go that route, it is interesting to see how AI is impacting the audio world. Now, in 2023, we also saw that Apple launched their AI-generated books. This was their way of combating Amazon's hold on the market. And this is literally an AI version of an audiobook generated by Apple. We also saw that Amazon has said recently, as early as October, late October, that they are going to be testing out voice narrated books. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast for any amount of time, you know I am an avid reader. I love reading books. I read upwards of 250 books per year. And this is really concerning to me as someone who definitely wants to support creatives who are voice actors and are actually putting their voice out there, creating these incredible books, and someone who is a reader, right? So when I'm reading a book or when I am consuming an audiobook, I think it's really important that I know right out of the gate whether this is an AI generated book or if it is actually a voice actor who is a person behind the microphone creating this book. While I do think that it is an interesting way for maybe some indie podcasters to be able to create books at a lower cost, it does create some concern. We also saw a lot of AI generated covers in 2023 for books, and that is also a concern as well. So we can see there are some pros and cons to the AI that has really shifted and rocked the world in 2023. But it's going to be interesting to see how that changes and impacts us as we go into 2024. One thing that I do want to make sure that we consider as we are looking at how AI is impacting podcasting is that we think about the ways and the tools that are actually going to make a difference in our podcasting workflow. So go back to the episode talking about podcast workflows, how to create one. I have workshops for all of that, the checklist, all of that information is available to you. So make sure that you go look at that. But when we're considering your podcast workflow, it is really, really important that you are finding ways to optimize that workflow, that you are finding ways to perhaps shorten that time that you are taking from concept all the way through marketing your podcast episodes. So with all of that to say, yes, AI is here and it is here to stay, but how can we make the most of it rather than pushing it away as something that is new, something that is foreign, something that is quote unquote taking over the world? How can we use it to become more efficient and more deliberate creators? You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together. In 2023, we also saw the rise and the shift of some of those podcast listening apps that every one of us that has been listening for any amount of time has grown to love. We saw the fall of Stitcher, which is a podcast listening app that has been around for as long as I've been listening to podcasts. I remember listening to podcasts on Stitcher in 2015. They were acquired by SiriusXM in 2020 for $325 million. We do have a blog post about how that entire thing occurred, how it's going to impact or not impact podcasters everywhere. And so you can go back and look at that blog post. But it is important to consider that, yes, there are falls and shifts, but it goes back to what is it that we need to know as podcasters to make the most of our show. So yes, there was the fall of Stitcher that happened in August of this year. We also saw Google make some really major changes to podcasting. So they stopped in February showing podcast episodes as their kind of carousel. You might have seen that when someone searches for something specifically. This impacted us as podcast producers because we were using Google Podcast Manager to see what searches were people using, what searches were people actually looking for in order to find our clients' podcasts. That helped us really optimize SEO and create SEO best practices for our clients. Now, without that, there are some additional things that we have to do, but that was a really fun way, an easy way for us to see what was working in those searches. That change happened in February. Then moving on to this fall, in September, October timeframe, YouTube Music announced that they are going to be taking over the Google Podcasts, and people could then start moving their podcasts from Google Podcasts over to YouTube Music. Now, a lot of the podcast industry leaders behind the scenes don't really like this idea. They feel that podcasting should be something that is audio mostly. And the way that YouTube wants to go about really making the most and getting their foot in the door with this, a lot of the podcasters are not in alignment with that. So I'm interested to see how this all shakes out, but we did see this shift and it's going to continue into 2024. It's also no surprise that we also saw a huge influx of podcast listeners and regular podcast listeners, as we're describing as monthly podcast listeners, from 2020 to 2021. We did see quite a fall in that for 2022. So the people who started listening in 2020 and then an increase in 2021 as they were moving back into working in the workplace, really figuring out their work schedule, that number of monthly podcast listeners actually declined in 2022. Now we're hoping, and we have seen an influx of new podcast listeners in 2023, which is really exciting. So one of the things that you have probably seen if you've been watching any TV at all is the Allstate commercial that is, there's a podcast about that. I actually love that commercial so much. I think it's so fun. And a lot of the times, whenever it comes on the TV, my sons are like, Mom, you work with podcasts. And I was like, yeah, I do. So I love it. I think that it brings more notoriety and information about podcasts, that there is a podcast about everything and that there's something for everyone in podcasting. So I love it. I think that is exciting, but it also is creating more of an interest in podcasts as an audio medium, which I love. Quick review of our 2023 podcast predictions. You can obviously read all of that in the blog post or go listen to the Future of Podcasting episode from December of last year. But those were: number 1, SEO will be more important than ever. Number 2, video will not be the future of podcasting. Number 3, content standards are going to be higher than ever. Number 4, the importance of following the data. And number 5, listeners, people, over downloads, numbers. So here are our 2024 podcast predictions. I'm excited about these because I love the direction that podcasting is going. I think that it is a great time to get into podcasting. So if you're someone who has been considering it or thinking about it and maybe wants to take the dive, I highly recommend now is the time. Let's do it. So, number 1, evergreen content will reign supreme. Podcast listeners love to binge podcast content. They are adamant about being able to have something that they can go back and listen to time and time again. We also sometimes, and I say we because I love listening to podcasts, at least I did before I started producing them. And so I definitely consider myself an avid podcast listener, even though I maybe don't listen as much anymore. That all said, podcast listeners also love that they can go back and listen to something again and it hits and resonates the second time around. So think about those movies that are tried and true, those movies that it doesn't matter what time of year, it just fills your soul and makes you happy, or it really just drives home a point about society, about your life, about whatever that you feel, oh, I could watch this again. That's how podcast listeners are. So they love to be able to listen to something, and then when they're maybe struggling with it again, they can go back and listen to it another time. As podcasters, it is imperative that we are creating content that our listeners can binge. The best way to do that is to create evergreen content. It is so important, and I cannot drive this home enough, that as you are creating and crafting and planning out your podcast content, you need to be thinking about, is this going to be something that my audience can use in 6 months? Is this something they can use in 3 months? Or is this something that is timely? And while I do think that we can actually create timely content, and there's nothing wrong with that, I think it's important that we let our audience know, hey, this is applicable today, like this episode. This episode might not stand the test of time because it is about predictions for 2024. I'm talking about things that have happened this year. And while someone who listens to this in 3 months might be able to get some value, 6 months from now, it might not be as relevant. So letting your audience know, hey, where can you go to find more relevant information, whether that is your most recent podcast episodes, or maybe it's your newsletter, any of those ways that they can go and find more relevant and up-to-date information is going to be key for podcast listeners. As business owners, it's also really important that we are creating evergreen content. Work smarter, not harder. Please, please, please. I have seen so many podcasters go about this where they are talking about what they're doing this week. They are name dropping ages, they are name dropping seasons. And while that can still resonate with your audience right now, it might not resonate with them when it comes to 3 months down the road, when someone is going back and binge listening to all of your episodes. So here is your action item for this prediction. And I will have action items for every single one of these predictions. Take action this way. Plan your next 8 podcast episodes with evergreen content in mind. This will help you be able to show up in the next 8 episodes with evergreen content that your audience can use no matter what time of year it is. And you can promote it any time of the year. It does not matter. That is one of the things that I love about creating evergreen content, is that your audience can use it any time of year. Yes, that's great, but also you can repurpose it and reuse it and reshare it no matter what the season is. If you're someone who has group programs or has open, close doors, depending on the time of year it is, dynamic content is the best way to monetize your show. We have an episode on that. We'll make sure that we link it in the show notes, but that is one way that you can still create evergreen content with the podcast episode content and use that dynamic content to monetize, let your audience know what you have open and what you don't. Number 2 of my 2024 predictions is video is the future of podcast marketing. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, Alicia, you said video was not the future of podcasting last year. Yes, I know I said that, and I still believe that. But when it comes to podcast marketing and sharing our podcast, talking about our podcast on places like social media or on search engines, I do think that video is going to be an important part of that shift. And I'm actually implementing that shift. It feels really scary. It feels really overwhelming, and I don't want to get in front of camera, but I do think it is the future of podcast marketing. Most of the major podcasts and smaller podcasts and marketers are using video, either in Reels, YouTube Shorts, YouTube videos, TikToks, whatever it is. They're using these strategies to gain traction for their show. If you do not do that, I do not think that you're going to be able to get in front of new audiences or vie for the attention of those potential listeners. So this is something that I think is going to be a really important part going into 2024. If you're looking at your marketing strategy for your business, for your podcast, this is something that I really do think that you need to consider. Here are some tools that I'm loving for specifically video marketing for your podcast. Riverside FM, like I said, has that really cool AI tool where it'll create those reels for you. We also like to use Headliner. If you're making an audiogram or a videogram between Headliner and Canva, you should be able to create something pretty seamlessly. Another one is Munch AI. They actually will take your video and disseminate it and chop and dice it up into multiple different ways of sharing on social media, depending on what platforms you like to use. So there are tons of different tools out there. Do some research, look at the ones that you want to use. If you're already using Riverside, I highly recommend that you add that to your workflow of creating those reels to be able to share on social media as a marketing strategy for your followers. Number 3 of the future of podcasting podcast predictions for 2024, bold and thought-provoking content wins. The thing about podcasting is that you can say whatever you want, right? You can be whoever you want to be behind this microphone. But if you are not digging deeper, and I say that, then it sounds a little fluffy, but stay with me. The fluff, the high-level conversations, those are not going to be the ones that make it across that win line next year. I don't think that if we continue to hold back, if we continue to play it safe with our content because we want everybody to like us, I don't think that we're going to be able to sustain. And I don't think that we're going to have a podcast that other people are going to be excited to share with their friends or with their family or with whomever. It's those podcasts that say, Step Aside, I'm Coming In, Step Aside, I'm Coming Through. Those are the podcasts that are going to actually outshine those of us who are playing small. And I don't mean that you have to be this big, bold, and exciting outside of your normal personality kind of person. I think that what you need to do is be real. Share the meat and potatoes with your audience. Share the behind the scenes with your audience. And I have a story for you on this topic because I think it's important. I recently listened to a training, and this was a training that I, as an agency owner, have seen tons and tons of times of how to get more leads for your agency, blah, 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 blah. The difference with this training is that the person that was talking shared a story about how they had gone from their agency doing fantastic. And then all of a sudden, they lost 3 major clients, which was about $13,000 a month in recurring revenue. You see, I have gone through something very similar to that this year. And when that happened in my business, I felt like no one understands. How did I let this happen? I'm such a failure. I felt all of these feelings. And to hear that this other person that I looked up to, that I had been following for years, that I had been almost idolizing, that they had gone through the exact same thing and the strategies that they used to get out of it, that inspired me. Now, if they had just said, oh, I am on the other side, and they had only talked about the wins and they had only talked about the incredible things that they were doing and why this was the thing that I needed today. If they had talked about just that stuff, I would not have even tried to download any of their stuff. I would not have bought any of their stuff. But it was because they were able to connect with the lowest of the low that I had felt, the lowest of the low that they had felt. They had been able to share that story. That made the difference. So here is your take action for number 3. In your next solo podcast episode, I want you to get vulnerable. I want you to share a story about the lowest low and how you were able to overcome it. And I want you to share some of those stories that maybe you sprinkled a little fairy dust on the last time, or maybe you made it out to seem like it wasn't as bad as it actually was. Take that story and tell it like it is. Really get vulnerable and get real with your audience in a way that you never have before. Okay? That is your action for number 3. Number 4 of our 2024 podcast predictions is that information is abundant, so be selective. This goes back to all of that information that I gave you at the beginning of all of the crazy things that happened in 2023. So many crazy things happened. It was crazy banana pants. But one thing that we know to be true is that when we are taking in information, especially as business owners, we have to decide based on our goals, based on our capacity, based on who we are as a person and how we like to work. Does this make sense for me? And one of the things that I definitely recommend when it comes to being informed and being selective about who you are taking information in from is potentially hiring someone who can help you along the way with this. So that is something that we do with our clients, where we are able to come in as a podcast strategist, give them actionable steps based on what it is that they are struggling with. And that allows them to not have to look at all of these new trends and what are the new apps and what is working and what's not, because we're doing it for them. So even when it comes to a podcast strategy, and even if you're not a client and you just come in for a strategy session, this is still a great way that you can get support for podcasting and understanding what it is that you need to do to take your podcast to the next level based on your goals. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It is a very custom strategy. That way, you don't have to look at all of this stuff. You can just say, where do I want my podcast to go? And yes, take me there. The action for number 4 is to decide on 2 to 3 sources of podcast information specifically that you are going to be following in 2024 for your updates and for how those updates might impact you as a podcaster and as a business owner. So decide on what those sources are going to look like. Maybe it's a newsletter that comes through. Maybe it's listening to a podcast, whatever it is. Decide on that and stick with it so that you can kind of open up your space for what is next year. And that way you can focus on what you need to do to grow your podcast rather than getting information from all around you on what everybody else is doing. Number 5 of our 2024 podcast predictions, and that is listeners or people over downloads or numbers. Now, this one has stayed the same from last year because I think that it continues to be just as important as it was last year. I think that it is something that we need to really remember as podcasters. And one way that I love to be able to remember this is to think about the number of downloads that you got on your last podcast episode. How many did you get? Now you've got that number in your head. Imagine that many people in a room. It doesn't matter the size of the room. Just imagine that many people in a room that fits that many people, and you are at front of that room and you are sharing your story. Now, I've talked about this before, but one of the number one things that I love about podcasting is that it creates such a connection with your audience. It's not someone scrolling through their phone, getting a dopamine hit. It is someone who has said, click, I want to listen to this person for the next 20 or 30 minutes. And that, my friend, is so powerful. So imagine these people have showed up and they have said, I want to hear what you have to say. Now, with that in mind, does that change how you plan on showing up for your next episode? I bet it does, because I know it does for me. It gives me goosebumps. It makes me think of all of the times when I saw that number and I was like, wah, wah, wah. No, those are people. Those are individuals who are listening to your message, who are actually making a difference in their life because of what you have said. That is powerful. All right, so the take action for that is I want you to connect or reconnect with one podcast listener in your DMs this week. Reconnect with them, connect with them, get to know them, answer a question, ask them how they're doing. Bring it back to that person and not that number. In conclusion, there are 3 things that I want you to really focus on this year, and that is think about your audience when you are creating your content. Consider them and think about them. Number 2, focus on your goals when you are deciding what you want to take action on. And then number 3, be consistent and persistent. And I think that if you do those things, you are going to have such an incredible 2024 with your podcast, and I am cheering you on. I know you're going to do incredible. Let me know which of these actions you plan on taking action on. Maybe it's all of them. Send me a DM and let me know, and I cannot wait to hear from you. Until next time, happy podcasting. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.